Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at a new chess event which is being held in Dubai. That event, of course, is the Global Chess League. Now, the Global Chess League is very similar to the Pro Chess League, an online event held by chess.com, which featured teams of 4 players competing each other. If you won your matches, you would advance. As I myself was part of the Gotham Knights, we did actually win the Pro Chess League this past season. Nonetheless, the teams are comprised of 6 players in the Global Chess League. You have a quote-unquote icon, a top 10, top 15 player on board number 1. You also have 2 female players as well as a junior player. So it's a 6-player team event, and there are many prominent players competing in it, including Levana Ronin, Jan-Krzysztof Duda, Shakira Mamedyarov, Richard Rapport, the runner-up in the World Championship, Jan Nepomniachtchi. You also have the former World Chess Champion, Vishy Anand, but most importantly, the 5-time and actually now former World Chess Champion, Magnus Carlsen, competing in the event. So let's jump right into the action. Now, today featured round number 4 and round number 5 of the Global Chess League, and Magnus was in action. Now, his team, the SG Alpine Warriors, were playing 2 matches, and both these matches, Magnus was playing with the black pieces. Now, this could be very good for Magnus and his team because if you win a game in the match with the black pieces, you get 4 points, whereas if the players with the white pieces win, they get 3 points. So essentially, if you win 1 game with black, your opposing team will have to win 2 games with the white pieces to offset that 1 loss. So if you win games with black, your team is in great shape. All right, so round number 4, we have our first game between Jan-Krzysztof Duda, the Polish junior player. I guess now he's not a junior anymore, and of course Magnus Carlsen. The game starts out with the move d4. We get knight to f6, c4, and Magnus chooses to play e6, trying to be very solid. We get knight to f3, d5, and now let's move knight c3. And here Magnus plays bishop e7, essaying the classic queen's gambit decline defense. Magnus has played all the moves under the sun here. He's played c5, the semi-Tarrasch. He's played bishop b4, which leads to the Rogozin. And of course, he's also played bishop e7 here. So in this game, Magnus tries to be very solid, quite similar to Norway chess, the last classical tournament he played in, where towards the end of the event, he tried to be very solid. He shut it down, played a queen's gambit decline against Shakira Mamedyarov and made a draw in either round 8 or round 9. I get the rounds confused at this point, but nonetheless trying to be very solid. Now, it's worth noting Magnus has had a pretty decent event so far, with 1 win against Vishy Anand and then 2 draws against Levana Ronin, as well as Jan Nepomniachtchi. So we got bishop to f4, castles, e3, c5. Pretty standard stuff so far, nothing super new. D takes c5, bishop takes c5, and now we get a3 being played, and Magnus goes knight to c6. And here Duda decides to play the move c takes d5. Now this move is playable, but generally it's not considered to be the most testing variation. Normally in this position, white plays the move queen to c2, and black has a couple of options. Black can play queen to a5 here, and after castles, bishop to e7. White can go g4, h4. This is very topical, very heavy mainline theory. It's been around for the last 20 years, but black should be objectively okay. It's also worth noting that after queen to c2, black can also play the very inventive rook to e8, which was played by Hikaru Nakamura numerous times in the last couple of years. Or I should say, not last couple of years, but in the pre-pandemic world when he was a pro chess player. At any rate, we get c takes d5 played here by Duda, and knight takes d5 played by Magnus. They trade the knights, and now Duda goes bishop to d3. Now, what white is hoping for in this position is long-term. He has this great bishop on d3 pointing towards the pawn in h7, and black also has this weak pawn on d5 down the road, which could become an isolated pawn. Nonetheless, Magnus is very well prepared, and he proceeds to equalize without any issues. He plays the move bishop to d6. Duda plays queen to a4 here. Magnus trades the bishops, and now he plays this very important move d4. If white could set up here, let's just say black were to go rook e8, castles, and a move like bishop to e6. After white gets rook fd1, let's just say queen e7 and knight to d4, takes. White has a great position here. Black has this isolated pawn on d5. Let's just say black was rook d8, bishop c2, rook d7, and bishop b3, for example. White is always ganging up and trying to win this pawn on d5. White can also put a rook on c1 and simply use the open c file as well. When you combine the open c file with the weakness on d5, white should have a long-term and lasting advantage. But Magnus plays this move d4 here, which is a very good move because simply black gets rid of this weak pawn, and even though temporarily sacrificing a pawn, he will be able to get it back with massive counterplay or simple equality. So here Duda plays knight takes pawn. If white were to play pawn takes pawn here, black can now go rook to e8 check. White cannot castle out of check because that would be an illegal move. And if white goes king to f1, for example, after bishop to e6, let's just say h3 and bishop to d5, black is completely fine here. This pawn on d4 is very weak. Additionally, black has moves like queen b6 to put pressure on both d4 as well as b2. And with the lack of development, the king on f1 and rook on h1, white is just in a lot of trouble. So we get knight takes d4, we get queen to a5 check, and now let's move king to e2. Duda, true to form, trying to play a pawn cloud. Now, if white were to play b4, which looks good on first glance, is actually a big blunder, because after knight takes pawn, if you capture the knight, you lose the rook in the corner, and then you lose the other rook as well, and you simply tip your king and resign the game, and you admit that there is a Magnus effect. However, after b4 knight takes b4, there's really nothing better white can do either. If white goes king to e2 after takes and bishop d7, computer actually thinks after king to e2 white's only marginally worse, but nonetheless black is much better here because you have ideas like rook c3, weak pawn on a3, king is still in the middle of the board, and black will get great chances at winning the game. So we get king to e2, typical pawn cloud, and now we get knight takes knight, queen takes knight, and Magnus goes rook to d8 here, attacking the queen on d4 and bringing the rook to the very nice open d file. Here, Duda plays queen b4, and now Magnus goes queen g5, attacking the pawn on g2. Of course, you do not want to trade the queens on b4, because suddenly you're simply down a pawn in an endgame, and white is much better. And just to illustrate one point for people who are wondering, if black was bishop g4, you do not play king to d2, because suddenly after bishop to f5, you have all kinds of problems on the d file, but you can simply play f3, and white is just much better. So we get queen g5, and now rook hd1 is played here by Duda, and now let's move bishop g4 by Magnus. Now it's worth noting, if you were to play queen takes g2, suddenly white has this very nice trick with bishop takes h7, king takes h7, and now let's move queen to h4, creating the classic right triangle, as well as a check on the king on h7. If black were to go king g8, rook takes d8 is simply checkmate, as the king has no squares. And after king to g6 here, white now can play his move rook to g1, not rook takes rook, by the way, because after bishop to g4, black is back in the game, but you have rook g1 pinning the queen, and the best that black has here is bishop to g4 check, queen takes bishop, queen takes queen, rook takes queen, king h7, and now after rook to c1, if we do the numerical count, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. White has an extra pawn here, control the c file, and white has great chances to win the game. But Magnus plays bishop g4, we get this move f3, and now Magnus plays bishop f5 here. Again, very, very precise play from Magnus, because he's putting pressure on the bishop on d3 while also threatening to capture the pawn on g2. And here Duda admits that his opening idea has not worked out, and he decides to take the bishop on f5, and Magnus correctly captures the pawn on g2. If you were to capture the bishop on f5, white can simply trade the rooks, play a move like rook to c1, and after queen d3, king f2, white is much better. If you go queen d2, we swap, I go king to e1, and now with the threat of the ice skater, you have to go back, and after rook d8, king e2, white is just up a pawn and close to winning. So Magnus takes on g2, and now after king to e1, queen g1, king e2, Magnus tries to make it look like he's playing on by capturing the pawn, but in reality it's simply leading to a draw after king e1, queen g1, king e2, and we get this draw by repetition here, and the game ends in a draw. So first game of the day in round number 4, Magnus draws this game. And we move on to the second round of the day, where Magnus is also playing with the black pieces against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Now in this game, Maxime decides to play e4, true to form. Now, I've said a lot of things about Maxime in recent times. He's been struggling. It feels like he peaked around 2018. His rating has just slowly been going down from about like 2780, 2790, down to where it stands today at about 2740. Now, those of you guys who are looking at the ratings are probably going to see like 2767. What are you talking about? He's higher rated. But these are rapid ratings. Now, one peculiar thing that I have noticed is I did go to the site 2700 Chess early today. And as these games are being played over the board, they should count for rating, but 2700 Chess is not listing them for rating. So I don't know if these games are actually rated for rapid chess or not. So we get e4. Magnus plays e5, knight to f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and now the vaunted Berlin defense with knight to f6. Here Maxime castles, knight takes e4, d4, knight d6, takes, de5, knight f5, queen d8, king d8, and knight c3. And now we have entered the Berlin endgame. Now, one interesting thing is there are not many players who like playing this endgame from the white side. The main reason being that black has a double op combo, and if black survives and gets the king out of the center of the board, generally in the long term, black can use the bishops effectively and potentially even generate winning chances. Additionally, a lot of what the Berlin defense consists of is pure memorization, and generally from the white standpoint, black has so many many moves that are playable, all of which should be fine. And so most top players don't like the idea of having to memorize against 20 different moves here. And then if you make a mistake, you can end up just much worse and even lose in an endgame. But Maxime along with Levon Aronian are probably the two players who most like playing this endgame from the white side. So after knight c3, we get bishop to e6 from Magnus, knight to e2 played here by Maxime. Again, many lines are playable here. Probably the most common line that people see these days is bishop d7 followed by king c8 b6 and king b7 to fianchetto the king instead of the bishop. Black can also play the old main line with king e8 h3 and then h5. This also has been beaten to death many times. This line has been played by all top grandmasters: Magnus, myself, Maxime, Sergei Karyakin. The list goes on and on and on. But sometimes you also want to have fun and play chess, and as Fabiano Caruana alluded to in a recent C-Squared podcast, you don't want to play the same thing all the time unless your name is Wesley So, in which case you are Mr. Rock Solid. I'll play the same opening for 20 years in a row with no issues whatsoever. Now again, that's not me making fun of Wesley, but those are more or less Fabiano's words. I am paraphrasing slightly, but nonetheless, there are some players who will just try to be rock solid forever. That being said, Magnus wants to have some fun, and he goes bishop e6, knight to e2, and now we get bishop to d5. Here Maxime plays rook d1, trying to pin the bishop on d5, and now Magnus goes king e8. We get knight to d4. Knights come off the board. Main reason that Maxime plays knight d4 here is quite straightforward. If you play a move like bishop f4, black can simply trade the bishop for the knight, and now you have these doubled f-pawns. Now, this is not always the end of the world. There are actually quite a few lines in the Berlin endgame where you're happy to get this trade, but in this case, it doesn't make all that much sense. So when Maxime plays knight to d4, we get the trade of knights, and now what he's aiming to do is play knight to f5 potentially and put pressure on the pawn on g7, or just start pushing pawns in the center and expanding. So let's just say black plays random moves here, and you get some random moves like this. Even here, black is okay, but white has acquired a lot of space in the center of the board. Also worth noting that, let's just say in a position like this, white can go knight f5, asking black how is he going to develop the bishop, bring the king and the rook into the game. Keep in mind, black has moved the king, so it is illegal to castle the king. And if black goes g6, now white can even go knight e3 and f4 g4 ideas again, or even potentially things like knight h6 and knight g4 knight f6 at any rate. So after a6, we get bishop to f4 being played here. Now we get rook to c8 played by Magnus. Idea here behind rook to c8 is simply that Maxime is trying to play e6 and attack the pawn on c7. We get rook to d2. Now we get c5 being played here. Now this is not a move that I'm super fond of. Again, I would kind of like to develop this bishop, because after knight to f5, you can maybe go g6 or maybe rook g8 as well. And it feels like with the active bishop and the idea of moving your bishop back on the next turn, let's just say you get a position like this, white will not be able to keep the knight on f5 very long. Nonetheless, Magnus plays c5, and this is a very committal move here, because once you go c5, now white is going to try to jump with the knight to these center squares, either e4 or d5 via c3. Whereas if you think about the pawn being on c6, if white goes I guess it's black's move, let's just say you get a position like this and you go bishop e6, white can never go to the d5 square because the pawn is in the way. Whereas in this position, after c5, knight e2, bishop e6, rook d1, bishop e7, and knight c3, now the knight is going to d5 right away. And if you play c6 to try and stop the knight from going to d5, now you have some serious problems with knight e4, and down the road, ideas like bishop g5 are a problem. Maybe even knight d6 is a problem. This still maybe is okay for black, but you've ended up in a situation where you have to yield either d5, or if you go c6, yield the d6 square. Whereas with the pawns all the way back on c7 and c6 here, black never really has to yield anything in this position. Just for example, this situation, if knight still can't go to d5, and from e4 the pawn covers a square. So in this position, both of these pawns cover the critical squares, whereas once you play c5, now it's definitely an issue. So we get to this position after knight c3. We get g5 being played here by Magnus. Now this is not a move that I like, as it feels like it creates some weaknesses. White can now also jump to e4 and f6, or put pressure on the pawn on g5, and it just feels like a slight problem. Nonetheless, I think Magnus probably played it because in a rapid game here, you're running out of time. Like, the time is not super low, but you feel like you need to come up with a plan here. And if you don't have a plan and you spend 3-4 minutes trying to calculate some super long line, you've wasted 3 to 4 minutes. You're going to struggle down the road on time, and there are no obvious decisions. Now, this is also one of the reasons that I strongly feel like Anish Giri in my Armageddon game against him in Norway chess chose to go into the end game as well, because they felt like there are situations where black has to either decide, do I use time, try to come up with a precise solution, or do I just get impatient and just play a quick move right away? And if you do that, you're going to get chances. So I think that equilibrium or imbalance is what Maxime was hoping for. And it seems to have worked here, because after bishop to e3, white is a little bit better. according to the computer. So we get rook to g8 played by Magnus, so that if white goes knight to e4, there's no threat towards the pawn on g5. You're simply guarding it with both the bishop as well as the rook. So here Maxime goes knight d5, and now we get bishop takes knight and rook takes bishop, and I think we can safely say that at this point Maxime has gotten exactly what he wanted. Black no longer has the pair of bishops. Black has the double pawns, the weakness on c5, the weakness on g5, and white should be a little bit better, especially with the double stack controlling the only open file on the board as well. So we get c4 from Magnus, we get g4 here played by MVL, another very nice move, fixing the pawn on a dark square where his bishop can always spy it. We get rook to g6 here. Magnus trying to activate the rook, either going to c6, e6, or h6 potentially, but again the rook has no way to get to the center of the board. If you go bishop f8 for example, I guess you can try some king e7 and king e6 and hopefully get bishop e7. If you try to go bishop g7, that would just hang the pawn on g5. Nonetheless, it's a very slow plan and white should be better. So we get rook g6, king e2. Magnus plays rook d8 here. The rooks come off the board, and now we get this interesting move h4 being played. Now h4 is not necessarily a bad move, but the more natural idea is to go king to f3 with the idea of going king e4. Now the reason that MVL did not play this idea is because he was obviously worried about rook to h6 putting pressure on the pawn in h2, and after rook to h1 and rook to h3 suddenly it's not really clear how white gets rid of this weakness on h2. If you ever move the rook, you hang the pawn. If you don't move the rook, then your rook is always glued guarding this pawn, and you can't really do a whole lot in the center of the board. Nonetheless, it's worth pointing out that here you can play the in-between move h3 first, and after rook to h6, rook to h1, let's just say rook to e6 and bishop d4 followed by king e4. It feels like white is a little bit better here, but MVL goes to h4 instead. Magnus takes, we get king to h3 here, and the idea for white is quite simple. You're down a pawn, but it is a double pawn on h4, and additionally now you want to push f4, f5 and just take all the space in the center as fast as possible, and black has to react very accurately. So here we get rook to e6, and now Maxime makes a strange decision. He plays this move bishop to d4. Now the very natural move here is to simply go f4, and after f6 you can play bishop d4 takes and bishop takes e5, and it feels like white should be a little bit better with these pawns on g4 and f4 in the end game, potentially a passed f pawn. h4 always a little bit weak, and the computer also agrees that white should have a slight advantage. Nonetheless, Maxime plays this move bishop d4 instead, and I think Maxime overlooked this nasty move bishop g5 because now white can no longer push f4, f5, and because of that black also will get a bishop to f4, and the e5 pawn can become a serious weakness. So we get bishop c3. Magnus goes b5 here. Maybe b4 is an idea to deflect the bishop away from guarding the pawn, also simply creating connect 3 as well. We get a3, and now we have this move f6. Now it's interesting that the computer thinks that after bishop to f4 black is actually a little bit better here, and the reason is that white played this move a3. Now at first glance you're saying, well, what's going on? The reason that after rook to e1 f6 takes. Now after bishop to e5 here, you're attacking both the pawns on f6 as well as b2, and if white goes g5 here, you can now play this move bishop takes b2, and the pawn on a3 is hanging. If we go back to this position with the pawn on a2, for example, let's just play a random move like rook b1, bishop f4, rook e1 f6, takes, bishop to e5, g5 here, takes, king takes h4. White is simply close to winning, and the reason is the a pawn is not hanging on a3, and after black plays something like c5, you can simply go bishop a5, b4, and now after f4, king f7, you can go king h5 here. Let's just say black plays bishop c3, bishop d8, bishop b2, and now after f5, white is going to play g6 next move. The bishop on d8 guards the pawn on f6, and with these two connected passed pawns or the triangle box, white is simply winning. But by playing a3 and putting this pawn on a dark square, now Magnus had a golden opportunity to go for this bishop f4, rook e1 f6 line, but he doesn't do it. Instead he plays f6 here. We get e takes f6, bishop takes f6, and now after bishops come off the board and rook d2 is played, white maybe has a slight advantage, but objectively it should be a draw, because as long as black doesn't let white get the f and g pawns rolling up the board, you figure that with a move like rook f3 and maybe c3 it should be fine. So Magnus does play c3 here, very nice move, hoping for b takes c3, because after rook to f3 check, king takes h4, rook takes c3. Now the pawn on a3 is hanging, and if white plays a move like f4 takes and f5, black can simply go rook c3 and just pushes the a pawn down the board, and his king is also very close to stopping this f pawn, which would like to get to the f8 square and become a queen itself. So MVL plays rook e2 check, we get king to f7, and now he plays this move b4 here, fixing the pawns on b4 and b5 and trying to keep his pawn structure intact. Now this position is still completely fine, but now Magnus makes a huge mistake by playing this move rook to d6. In this position, the correct way to save the game is a little bit counterintuitive, I suppose, although it makes a lot of sense, which is pawn to c5, because after pawn takes pawn and rook c6, the only way white can guard the extra pawn is rook e5, and now after a5, king takes h4 and b4, black is getting these pass pawns rolling on the b or the c file potentially, and after takes king g3, for example, after b3 takes c2, you have to go rook e1, rook c5, rook c1, rook c3, f3, and now here it's just a simple draw. Probably the easiest way is to go king g6, b4 h5, trade off the pawns, and after b5, rook c5, b6, rook b5, rook c2, rook b6. This is simply a classic draw. White is up a pawn here, but this is a standard, well-known theoretical draw. It's been known for the last 300 plus years. But here, when Magnus goes rook d6, now after rook to e3, suddenly black has problems, because now c5 is no longer a move. After takes rook c6, I just take the pawn and guard on c5. I win h4, and suddenly white's going to have 2 extra pawns on the board once you capture this pawn on the edge. So black still maybe can save the game, but you have to be extremely precise, and now Magnus outright blunders with rook to d2. In this position, after rook to c6, king takes h4, black still possesses decent drawing chances with rook c4, because if white plays a move like king h5, now you can go c5 with the exact same idea that after takes g5, you can simply go a5, b4, b3, and white's probably not going to be able to win the game. But Magnus plays rook d2, and now after rook takes c3, it is all gone completely for Magnus Carlsen. Completely lost position. He plays rook f2, but now after king takes h4, you cannot save the pawn on c7, which means that white will be up at least 1 pawn, and additionally white is going to have a 3-on-2 on the queen side, and technically speaking, it is completely lost. Magnus plays king to f6 here, and now MVL captures on c7. We get rook to e2, and now rook c6 is played. Not rook takes h7, because then there is rook to h2 check, winning the rook on h7, and the Magnus effect is back in full force. So we get the move rook to c6, and now Magnus plays king e5. You cannot block with the rooks, because after rook takes rook, actually I thought rook takes rook was winning. Maybe this is still a draw. Maybe Magnus should have played rook e6, but with limited time he doesn't do it, although I guess this is somehow a draw. Weirdly this is actually a draw, I guess, or maybe I'm wrong. I'm confused. One second, let me take a look. Wait, why is this winning? Apparently this is winning for black. Wow. Okay, so apparently I don't know my end games, but neither does Magnus Carlsen, because if Magnus Carlsen knew his end games, he probably would have played this move rook to e6. And it's very weird that this end game is not apparently winning, but Magnus probably thought it was, which is why he rejected this move. Instead, he goes king to e5, and now we get king to g5. Magnus plays king d5, and after rook takes a6, rook takes c2, and rook b6, Magnus Carlsen, the former world chess champion, resigns this game against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, as the position is completely hopeless. Here black really can't do much. If you move the rook to a2, I just take the pawn, and after king c4 and rook to a5, this is completely lost. White has 2 connected pawns. You can even go king h6 and win the pawn on h7. There's just no hope. And if you play something like king c4, now white can actually, I believe, trade the rooks into the king and pawn endgame, because after king h6, king b3, you're simply too slow here. White gets a queen, and white wins the game. Just to illustrate why this is winning, this is very basic, of course, but after check, what you do is you zigzag the queen back. As long as black can't push the pawn forward, you will eventually be able to win the game. You just keep checking, check, and finally you check here. King can't go away because you lose the pawn, and after king b2, you start slowly bringing the king back. After black plays king a3, you do the exact same dance. You go check, the king comes back, you go here, king goes to b4, you can even go queen f6 here, and after king a3, queen a1, king b4. Now you can just keep bringing the king back. Black cannot move the king forward, the queen stops the pawn, and this is very basic as well. So for that reason, after the move rook to b6 is played, Magnus resigns this game, which means that Magnus's result now for a second event in a row in terms of order of the board chess is not all that great. He now has 1 win against Vishy Anand. He has 3 draws against Duda, Aroni, and Nepo, and now a loss against Maxime. So he's on an even score here. 1 win, 1 loss, 3 draws. Not a great performance. The second event in a row where Magnus is struggling. Nonetheless, there are still 4 more rounds of chess to be played in the Global Chess League. He could obviously get angry, turn it around, and win 4 in a row. So it's anyone's guess what will happen. But nonetheless, definitely a little bit shocking to see Magnus lose, or more precisely, to lose in an endgame. Out of all the sort of positions that Magnus loses, losing basic endgames is not really what we've come to expect. In fact, we think Magnus is the magician who will win any endgame no matter how bad it looks. At any rate, Magnus loses the game, so he's on an even score. I believe his team still was able to tie the match, so SG Alpine Warriors are still tied for the lead overall, but nonetheless a little bit shocking to see. At any rate, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and we'll be back with more great content, recaps, videos, everything else that you guys enjoy here on YouTube in the very near future. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you soon. Bye.